objective. Good day to you, Dean, and to all my classmates. My name is Zarina Elena V. Corrales from MBA 203, Section 3. My topic to be discussed is about the global resource management. The learning objectives of this report are as follows. First is to list the HR challenges of international business. Next is to illustrate with examples how inter-country differences affect HRM. Next is to list and briefly describe the main methods for staffing global organizations, to discuss some important issues to keep in mind in training, appraising, and compensating international employees, and to explain with examples how to implement a global human resource management program. More managers today are managing people internationally. The purpose of this report is to improve the effectiveness in applying the human resource knowledge and skills when global challenges are involved. The topics we'll discuss include the manager's global challenge, adapting human resource activities to inter-country differences, staffing the global organization, training and maintaining employees abroad, and managing HR locally, or how to implement a global HR system. As you can see in the illustration on the left portion of our slide, the top priority is the company's strategic goals, and in order to achieve them, there must be employee competencies and behaviors. Then furthermore, in order to produce the employee competencies and behaviors, we have also here the HR policies and practices such as the employees relations, strategic and legal environment, recruitment and placement, training and development, and compensation. Okay, so let us discuss the manager's global challenge. The challenging thing about managing globally is what works on one country may not work in another. The employer faces an array of political, social, legal, and cultural differences among countries and the people abroad. For example, an incentive plan that works in the United States backfires in some European country where workers need a predictable weekly wage to buy the necessities. However, in spite of such inter-country differences, the employer must create for each country's local facility and for the company as a whole a workable set of human resource policies and practices. So by going global, it also means that the employers must address the international human resource management issues. So what is the international human resource management? Well, the IHRM deals with the global HR challenges, and we can also define IHRM as the human resource management concepts and techniques that the employers use to manage the challenges in their international operations. The IHRM focuses on these three main topics below. Number one is managing the human resource in global companies. Number two, managing expatriate employees. And lastly, comparing human resource management practices in different countries. Now let us discuss how to adapt the human resource activities to inter-country differences. The challenges of international human resource management don't just stem from the distances involved, although it is also important, but the bigger issue is dealing with the cultural, political, legal, and economic differences among countries and their people. So the result is that what works in one country might fail in another. For example, the different states and municipalities in the US certainly have their own employment laws. However, a basic federal framework helps produce a predictable set of legal guidelines regarding matters such as employment discrimination and labor relations. But the point is that the managers must have to adapt to the human resource policies and practices to the countries in which they are operating. So here in this figure number one, we also have other differences such as labor relations, um, economic, like what I said a while ago, cultural, political, and legal. Cultural factors. So the countries differ widely in their cultures. In other words, in the basic values their citizens adhere to, and in how these values manifest themselves in the nation's arts, social programs, and ways of doing things. These cultural differences manifest themselves in differences on how people from different countries think, act, and also expect others to act. For example, the head of group purchasing at Michelin says that when he gives performance feedback in France, employees don't think it's necessary to mention what's right because they know that what they've done or they already know what they've done right. Instead, they focus on what's wrong. But that approach would surprise most of the US employees, so there's a tendency for US managers to sugarcoat what they think is wrong. On the other hand, in China, the heads of the companies are inclined to see employees as members of their family, but in turn demand so much also from them. So those are different cultures in different countries. Then we have here the Hofstede study. So studies by Professor Gert Hofstede illustrate international cultural differences. Hofstede says that societies differ in five values, which he calls power distance, individualism, masculinity, uncertainty avoidance, and long-term orientation. For example, power distance represents the degree to which the less powerful people accept the unequal distribution of power in society. Dr. Professor Hofstede also concluded that acceptance of such inequality was higher in some countries, such as in Mexico, than in other countries, such as Sweden. So in turn, such differences manifest themselves in different behaviors. Such cultural differences influence the human resource policies and practices in the country. For example, in America, Americans emphasize on individuality may help explain why European managers have more constraint, such as in dismissing workers. So another example are countries with history of autocratic rule. The employees there often had to divulge information. So the whistleblower rules are less popular in these countries. Another factors are the legal factors, where the employers expanding abroad must also be familiar with the labor laws in the countries they're entering. For example, in India, companies with more than 100 workers need government permission to fire anyone. Whereas in Brazil, firing someone without just cause could trigger a fine of 4% of the total amount the worker ever earned. And in Europe, firing or laying off workers is usually expensive. There are also work councils composed of formal employee elected groups of worker representatives who meet monthly with managers on topics ranging from no-smoking policies to layoffs. And lastly, in Germany and other several countries, co-determination is a rule, which means employees have the legal right to a voice in setting company policies. These workers elect their own representatives to the supervisory board of the employer. Similarly, differences in economic systems translate into differences in inter-country HR practices. In market economies such as the United States, governments play a relatively restrained role in deciding what will be produced and sold at what prices. Whereas in planned economies such as the North Korea, the government decides and plans what to produce and sell at what price, while in economies such as China, many industries are still state-owned, while others make decisions based on market demand. These differences in economic systems tend to translate into differences in human resource management policies. So, for instance, dismissing employees in China or Europe is more difficult than in the United States, and labor costs also vary widely. Okay, this is an example for situation abroad, like the European Union. So, For the EU, the separate countries of the former European Community, or EC, unified into a common market for goods, services, capital, and even labor, which is called the European Union, or EU. Tariffs for goods moving across borders from one EU country to another generally disappeared, and employees generally moved freely between jobs in EU countries. The introduction of a single currency, which is the euro, by a subset of EU countries further blurred differences. Despite, or perhaps partly because of recent fiscal problems, EU countries today are moving towards increased economic integration. Companies doing business in Europe must adjust their human resource policies and practices to EU directives or laws, as well as to country-specific employment laws. The directives are binding on all member countries, but each country can implement them as they wish. This interplay of EU directives and country laws means that an employer's human resource practices must vary from country to country. For example, the minimum EU wages. So most EU countries have minimum wage systems. Some set national limits, while others allow employers and unions to work out their own minimum wages. Next are the working hours. The EU sets the work week at 48 hours, but most EU countries set it at 40 hours. And then last example is the termination of employment. Required notice periods in Europe impede dismissals of employees. Another example we have here is China. For years, the employers relied on China's huge workforce to provide products and services at low cost. Part of the reason for the low labor cost was the lack of labor laws on things like severance pay, minimum wages, and benefits. But now things are already changing. China has a new labor contract law which adds many new employment protections for employees and makes it more expensive for employers in China to implement personal actions such as layoffs. On the other hand, multinational companies doing business in China argue that the new law will raise labor costs and make it difficult to lay off employees by instituting new severance package rules. Now, there are therefore wide variations in how companies in China deal with HR issues, such as the following. Number one is recruiting. As compared to some Western countries, it is relatively difficult to recruit, hire, and retain good employees. China's employment contract law requires that, among other things, the employers report the names of the employees, sexes, also their identification numbers, and the contract terms for all employees they hire within 30 days of hiring to local labor bureaus. Also in China, recruiting effectiveness depends on non-recruitment human resource management issues. The employees gravitate towards employers that provide the best career advancement, training, and opportunities. While also poaching employees is a serious matter in China, the employer must verify that the applicant is free to sign a new employment agreement. Number two is selection. The dominant employee selection method involves analyzing the applicant's resume and then interviewing him or her. The ideal way to do this is to institute a structured interview process, as many of the foreign firms in China have already done. For the compensation, although many managers endorse performance-based pay in China, other employers, to preserve group harmony, make incentive pay a small part of the pay package. And as in other parts of Asia, team incentives are therefore advisable. And lastly, in their labor unions, China's new labor law expands workers' rights. China's government may see the strikes as a way of raising workers' incomes and thus supporting its desire to boost consumer spending. Now, let us compare small businesses' HR practices in the United States and China. Cross-country differences tend to manifest themselves in small businesses too. For example, one study compared practices in 248 small US companies with those in 148 small Chinese companies. First, in terms of job analysis. Jobs in small Chinese companies tend to be more narrowly defined and set in stone than those in small US businesses. What does it mean? So, for example, the small Chinese firms have more up-to-date job descriptions. Their employees also deviate from their assigned job duties less frequently. Their job descriptions tend to cover all the job's duties, and the job descriptions shape what the workers do. Similarly, the researchers found significant differences in performance appraisal practices between US and Chinese firms. In Chinese firms, compared to the United States, performance appraisals more often focus on the bottom line. Appraisal feedback is evaluative rather than developmental. The appraisal focuses on objective, quantifiable results, and the main objective is to improve performance rather than to develop the employee. Perhaps surprisingly, therefore, performance appraisals in small Chinese companies tend to be more inflexible than those in the United States. And finally, perhaps also surprisingly, given that China's communist roots, there's more emphasis on incentive pay than guaranteed salaries in China's small businesses. Employees in the Chinese firms are more likely to receive bonuses based on the company's profits, to receive bonuses based on company-wide gain sharing plans, to get stock or stock options as incentives, and to be paid based mostly on an incentive plan rather than on a guaranteed income plan. Our next focus is staffing the global organization. Employers' focus today is increasingly on managing human resource activities locally. In other words, the main concern is on selecting, training, appraising, and managing the in-country employees where they do business. However, deciding whether to fill local positions with local versus expatriate or imported employees also remains a major concern. In general, we can classify an international company's employees as expatriates, home country nationals, locals or host country nationals, or third country nationals. So what does this mean? The expatriates or expats are non-citizens of the countries in which employees are working, while home country nationals are citizens of the country in which the multinational company has its headquarters. The locals, on the other hand, are citizens of the countries in which the employees are working. They are also called host country nationals. And lastly, the third country nationals are the citizens of a country other than the parent or the host country. Some companies prefer to use locals based on the following reasons. Number one, the cost of using expatriates is usually far greater than the cost of using local workers. There is low attrition rate, and for example, in the US, it is more difficult to bring workers into the country. So US employers must vigorously recruit US workers before filing foreign labor certification requests with the Department of Labor. Other companies also prefer using expats, since the employers often can't find local candidates with the required qualifications, or multinationals also view a successful stint abroad as a required step in developing top managers, and some has assumption that home country managers are already steeped in the firm's policies and culture, so they are more likely to apply the headquarters way of doing things. However, the trend has been toward using locals or other non-expat solutions because posting expatriates abroad is expensive, and there are also security problems which gives potential expatriates pause, and returning expatriates often leave for other employers as well within a year or two. There are also educational facilities that are turning out top quality candidates abroad. So as a result, new expatriate postings tend to be down, and many employers are bringing them home early. Actually, a survey found that about 47% of US multinationals were maintaining the size of their expat workforces, while 18% of them were increasing it and 35% were decreasing it. However, about half the global companies in one recent survey said that they were doubling the number of expats they sent to countries like China. Now, there are also other solutions. The choice is not just between expatriate versus local employees. For example, there are commuter solutions, which involves frequent international travel but no formal relocation. And also, one survey found that about 70% of surveyed employers had some form of localization. This localization policy, is transferring a home country national employee to a foreign subsidiary as a permanent transferee. So, given the expense of sending employees abroad for overseas assignments, the employer's human resource team plays a big role in controlling and reducing expatriate costs. A survey shows some of the steps HR managers are taking to reduce these expenses. First, companies are upping the numbers of short-term assignments that they make. This lets them use short-term expats to replace some long-term expats and their respective families who the company must maintain abroad for extended periods. 50% of the companies surveyed are also replacing some expatriates postings with local hires. And then also, with an eye on cutting costs, many employers were also reviewing their firm's policies and procedures regarding things such as housing, educational and home leave, along with expatriate allowances and premiums such as cost of living allowance and mobility or quality of living premiums. But the bottom line is that there's a lot human resource managers can do to cut the costs and boost profits by better managing the expat assignments. So, what is offshoring? Offshoring is moving business processes such as manufacturing or call center operations abroad, and thus having local employees abroad do jobs that the firm's domestic employees previously did in-house is another globalization option. The human resource managers can help top management to understand the local labor markets in terms of their size, education levels, and unions. It also helps to understand how the firm's current employment-related reputation in the locale may affect outsourcing to here, to decide how much the firm should integrate the local workforce into the parent firm's corporate organization, to deal with skill shortages, which often requires using signing bonuses, higher wages, and improved promotion opportunities. And lastly, it helps to identify how to reduce attrition. This might include more training and development, better compensation, and improved career opportunities. Now let us go to the trends shaping the HR, which are the digital and social media. So managing internationally may also involve organizing transnational teams composed of employees located in various countries. Such teams, of course, often meet in virtual environments. Now, what are virtual teams? These are groups of geographically dispersed co-workers who interact using a combination of telecommunications and information technologies to accomplish an organizational task. In a Skype, FaceTime, or Zoom, virtual teams are both practical and popular, especially right now that we are facing the pandemic. Collaborative software systems such as Microsoft Net Meeting Conference System or Cisco WebEx and GoToMeeting enable virtual teams to hold live projects and discussions, share documents and exhibits, and store the sessions on the project's website. On the other hand, cloud-based tools such as Huddle allow team members to attend from wherever they are using mobile devices, and Microsoft Project lets project team members manage tasks and flag the issues and risks, while Dropbox facilities are cloud-based document storage. If necessary, large screen tools such as Cisco Immersive Telepresence make it seem as if the team members are together in the same room, although they may be thousands of miles apart. The main challenges virtual teams face are often people-related. Challenges include building trust, cohesion, and team identity, and overcoming the isolation among team members. Therefore, success depends on human resource management actions, such as to train virtual team members in leadership, conflict management, and meetings management, and how to respond swiftly to virtual teammates. It is also important to be scrupulous about answering emails and being positive, to select virtual team members using behavioral and situational interviews, where they describe how they'd respond to illustrative virtual team situations, and to use current virtual team members to help recruit and select new team members. Let us now proceed with the management values and different international staffing policy. It's not just hard facts that influence international staffing decisions. The top executives' personal inclinations and values also play a role. Some executives are just more expat-oriented, and experts also classify top executives' values as ethnocentric, polycentric, or geocentric. In an ethnocentrically oriented corporation, the prevailing attitude is that the home country attitudes, management style, knowledge, evaluation criteria, and managers are superior to anything the host country might have to offer. Such values translate into employment practices. With an ethnocentric staffing policy, the firms fills key management jobs with parent country nationals. Reasons given for ethnocentric staffing policies include lack of qualified host country management talent, a desire to maintain a unified corporate culture and tighter control, and the desire to transfer the parent company's core competencies, such as a specialized manufacturing skill, to a foreign subsidiary for more expeditiously. However, in the polycentric corporation, there is a conscious belief that only host country managers can ever really understand the culture and behavior of the host country market. Therefore, the foreign subsidiary should be managed by local people. A polycentric oriented firm staffs its foreign subsidiaries with host country nationals and its home office with parent country nationals. Such policies may reduce the local cultural misunderstandings that might occur if it used expatriate managers and be less expensive. And lastly, a geocentric staffing policy seeks the best people for key jobs throughout the organization, regardless of nationality. This global firm will transfer the best person to the open job wherever he or she may be. This can actually optimize placements and help build a more consistent culture among the global management team members. Let us go to the ethics and codes of conduct. Employers also need to make sure their employees abroad are adhering to their firm's ethics codes. However, exporting a firm's ethics rules requires more than giving employees abroad versions of the local employee handbook. So instead of exporting the employee handbook, some companies distribute and publicize a global code of conduct. Global employers need global codes of conduct on things like discrimination, harassment, bribery, and other laws. Now, how do we select international employees? In most respects, screening employees for jobs abroad is also similar to screening them for domestic jobs. For either assignment, candidates need the technical knowledge and skills to do the job, and the intelligence and also people skills to be more successful employees. Testing, interviewing, and background checks are as applicable for selecting expatriates as for domestic assignments. So first is let us discuss testing. In terms of personality, successful expatriate employees tend to be extroverted, agreeable, and emotionally stable. So not surprisingly, sociable, outgoing, conscientious people seem more likely to fit into new cultural settings. Intentions are also important. For example, people who want to expatriate careers try harder to adjust to such a life. Similarly, expatriates who are more satisfied with their jobs abroad are more likely to adapt to the foreign assignment. Another procedure in selecting international managers are realistic previews. So even in familiar foreign postings, there will be language barriers, bouts of homesickness, and new friends. Realistic previews about the problems as well as about the country's cultural beliefs are thus an important part of screening. The rule is always spell it all out ahead of time. Then we have adaptability screening. With flexibility and adaptability, which are very important, adaptability screening should be part of the screening process. Such screening aims to assess the assignees and also the spouse's probable success in handling the foreign transfer and to alert them to issues such as the impact on children, the way the move may involve. And employers often use specially trained psychologists for this type of screening. Now, another factors that the managers should also consider in selecting employees for international assignments are the legal issues. For example, the American Equal Employment Opportunity Laws does affect qualified employees of U.S. employers doing business abroad and also those foreign firms doing business in the United States or its territories. If equal employment opportunity laws conflict with the laws of the country in which the U.S. employer is operating, then the laws of the local country generally takes precedence. So what is the equal employment opportunity that the USA is implementing? It is actually an employment practice where the employers do not engage in employment activities that are prohibited by law. It is illegal for employers to discriminate against an applicant or employee on the basis of their race, age, color, sex, religion, or national origin. Another goal of an employer or a manager is to avoid early expatriate returns. The expatriate's assignment probably he or she makes an early and planned return. Systematizing the entire expatriate management process is one way to avoid such early returns. For example, employers should have an expatriate policy covering matters such as compensation and travel costs. This also includes procedures, for instance, those requiring that the manager responsible for the expat's costs should obtain all chain of command approvals. And another step in avoiding early returns is to test and select people who have the necessary traits and adaptability that we have like discussed earlier. And perhaps most importantly, consider the expat's family situation. Here are some of the reasons that lead to early expatriate returns. In one study, the U.S. managers listed in descending order of importance the reasons for expatriates leaving early, such as the inability of their spouse to adjust, the employee's inability to adjust, and other family problems, and also employees' personal and or emotional immaturity, and their inability to cope with larger overseas responsibility. So in the same study, it is also found that the problem is usually not incompetence, but family and personal problems. Yet many employers still often select expatriates mostly based on their technical competence. Now, what are the three things that make it easier? First is language fluency, since spouses will feel even more cut off if they can't communicate. Second, having preschool children seem to make it easier for the spouse to adjust. This suggests that younger children, perhaps because of their increased dependency, help the spouses retain their part of their social identities. And third, it helps if there is a strong bond of closeness between the spouse and the expat partners. This provides the continuing emotional support many spouses find lacking abroad. So here are some HR tools for line managers and small businesses. Expat failure is expensive. Managers can take several practical steps to improve the expat success abroad. Therefore, number one, the managers can provide realistic previews of what to expect abroad. Careful screening of both the prospective expat and his or her spouse. improved orientation, and improved benefits package. Number two is to shorten the length of the assignment, to use internet-based video technologies and group decision-making software to enable global virtual teams to conduct business without relocation, or to form global body programs where local managers assist new expatriates with advice on things such as office politics, norms of behavior, and where to receive emergency medical assistance. And lastly, to use executive coaches, which can be their mentor and work with expatriate managers. Now let us proceed to the training and maintaining employees abroad. So first, orienting and training employees on international assignment. Executives agree that international assignees do best when they receive the special training in things like language and culture that they require. So many vendors offer packaged pre-departure training. In general, the programs use on and offline lectures, simulations, videos, and readings to prepare the trainees. Their offerings illustrate the aim and content of such programs, and one of these programs aims to provide the trainee with the basics of the new country's history, politics, business norms, educational system, and demographics. It also provides an understanding of how cultural values affect perceptions, values, and communications. And lastly, they provide examples of why moving to a new country can be difficult and how to manage these challenges. So other programs also aims to boost self-awareness and cross-cultural understanding and to reduce stress and provide coping strategies. And some employers use also returning managers to cultivate the global mindsets of those who are departing. For example, like Bosch, they hold regular seminars where new arrived returnees pass on their experiences to the managers and their families who are going abroad. The employers can also conduct ongoing trainings. For example, aside from pre-departure trainings, more firms provide continuing in-country cross-cultural training during the early stages of an overseas assignment. So managers abroad, both the expats and locals, continue to need traditional skills-oriented development. Like in PepsiCo, they encourage the expatriates to engage in local social activities such as table tennis tournaments in China to help them become acclimated faster to local cultures. And international development activities hopefully have other less tangible benefits. Like, for example, rotating assignments can help managers form bonds with their colleagues around the world. This can help the managers from the informal networks they need to make cross-border decisions more expeditiously. Now let us discuss the performance appraisal of international employees. Several things complicate appraising an expatriate's performance. Cultural differences are one. For example, a candid exchange is often the norm in the United States, but sometimes less so in China where face is a concern. The local management must have some input, but again, cultural differences may distort the appraisals. On the other hand, home office managers may be so out of touch that they can't provide useful appraisals. In one survey, the managers knew that having appraisers from both the host and home countries produced the best appraisals, but in practice, most didn't. So instead, they had raters from the host or the home countries do them. Here are some suggestions for improving the expatriate appraisal process. Number one is to adopt the performance criteria to the local job and situation. Number two is to weigh the evaluation more toward on the on-site manager's appraisal than toward the home site managers. And lastly, if the home office manager does the actual written appraisal, have him or her use a former expatriate from the same overseas location for advice. So how do the companies compensate employees abroad? In compensating those it transfers abroad, an employer such as accounting and advisory firm KPMG has basically three choices. So KPMG continue paying based on the person's current home country pay. They also pay based on what locals in the new country are paid, or pay so the person's home country standard of living stays the same. So there is some logic in maintaining the person's home country pay, particularly if the assignment will be brief. On the other hand, paying the new expat based solely on what his or her new local peers are earning could be a shock if it means the person's former home country standard of living, especially for children's school and so forth, can't be maintained under strictly local pay rates. The fact is, it can be enormously more expensive to live in some countries like Japan than at others like India. If these costs of living differences aren't considered, it will be most impossible to get managers to take high-cost assignments. Therefore, the more popular approach is to use the third option, namely by paying expats so that on their new jobs, their pay is sufficient to maintain their former home country's standard of living. Here, most employers use what is called the balance sheet approach. It is the most common approach to formulating expatriate pay by equalizing the purchasing power across countries. The basic idea is that each expatriate should enjoy the same standard of living he or she would have had at home. The balance sheet approach addresses four groups of expenses such as the income taxes, housing, goods and services, and discretionary expenses for child support, payments, and the like. The employer estimates each of these four expenses in the expat's home country and in the host country. The employer then pays any differences such as an additional income taxes or housing expenses. The base salary will normally be in the same range as the manager's home country salary. In addition, however, there might be an overseas or foreign service salary premium. So the executive receives this as a percentage of base salary to compensate for the adjustment he or she will have to make. There may also be several allowances, including a housing allowance and an educational allowance for the expatriate's children. To help the expatriate manage his or her home and foreign financial obligations, most employers use a split pay approach. They pay, say, half a person's actual pay in home country currency and half in the local currency. So this is an example of the balance sheet approach, assuming that the US base salary is $160,000. So these are the four factors: housing and utilities, goods and services, taxes, and the discretionary income. So comparison of those that he or she should be receiving in Chicago, USA, and then what is equivalent in Shanghai, China. So there is the allowance. So we can they can compute it, total amounting allowance of $26,824. Incentives. Employers also pay various incentives to encourage the employee to take the job abroad. For example, they have foreign service premiums, which are financial payments over and above the regular base pay. These typically range from 10% to 30% of base pay and appear as weekly or monthly salary supplements. There are also hardship allowances that compensates the expatriates for hard living and working conditions at certain foreign locations. For example, some the U.S. diplomats posted to Iraq receive about a 70% boost in their base salary, among other incentives. There are also mobility premiums that are typically lump sum payments to reward the employees for moving from one assignment to another. Now we have here the steps in establishing a global pay system. First is to set strategy. We must first formulate longer-term strategic goals, like in terms of improving productivity or boosting the market share. Next is to identify the crucial executive behaviors. Here we have to list the actions that we expect the executives to exhibit in order to achieve the strategic goals. The next will be to establish a global philosophy net framework. Here we have to step back and ask, how do we want each pay component like the salary, bonus, incentives to contribute to prompting those executive actions? And then step 4 is to identify the gaps. Here we have to ask, to what extent do our pay plans in the world now support these actions and what changes, if any, are required? The next is to systemize the pay systems. We need to create more consistent performance assessment practices and establish consistent job requirements and performance expectations for similar jobs worldwide. And then lastly is to adapt the pay policies. Finally, we have to review our global pay policies, like for example, setting salary levels, incentives, and so forth. We can also conduct surveys and analysis to assess local pay practices. Then we can fine-tune the firm's global pay policies so they make sense for each location. Now let us discuss the terrorism, safety, and global HR. Terrorism abroad is a serious issue. Even stationing employees in assumedly safe countries is no guarantee. Therefore, the employers must consider taking protective measures. They had to institute more comprehensive safety plans abroad, including, for instance, evacuation plans to get employees to safety. Legally, these employers also have a duty of care for protecting international assignees and their dependents and international business travelers. Many employers use intelligence services for monitoring potential terrorist threats abroad. Some employers retain crisis management team services. Then they call on these teams, for instance, when criminals kidnap one of their managers. Like one of the executives said, when you have a specialist, there's a better chance to get the person back. So some also um, get kidnapping and ransom or KNR insurance. Hiring crisis teams and paying ransoms can be prohibitively expensive for all but the largest firms. So many employers um, buy kidnapping and ransom KNR insurance. So various events may trigger payments under such policies. The obvious one are kidnapping. For instance, the employee is a hostage until the employer pays a ransom. Another one is extortion or threatening bodily harm, and detention, which is holding an employee without any ransom demand. Here, the insurance typically covers several costs associated with kidnappings, abductions, or extortion. These include hiring a crisis team, the actual ransom payment, ensuring the ransom money in transit, the legal expenses, and the employee's death or dismemberment. The HR practices around the globe feature provide some practical examples. Now, here are the examples by keeping the business travelers safe. Number one is to provide the expatriates with training about the place they're going to so they're more oriented. The travelers must also arrive at airports as close to departure time as possible and wait in areas away from the main flow of traffic. They can also equip the expatriates' car and home with security systems. They can also tell the employees to vary their departure and arrival times and take different routes. The employees must be kept current on crime and other problems by regularly checking and to advise the employees to act confident at all times because, body language can attract perpetrators and those who look like victims often become victimized. Now let us discuss the repatriation, problems, and the solutions. One of the most worrisome facts about sending employees abroad is that 40% to 60% of them will probably quit within 3 years of returning home. Given the investment the employer makes in training and sending these high potential people abroad, it makes sense to try to retain them. For this, formal repatriation programs can be useful. Actually, one study found that about 5% of returning employees resigned if their firms had formal repatriation programs, while an increased percentage of 22% of those returning employees left if their firms had no such programs. For example, AT&T has a three-part repatriation program. First, AT&T matches the expat and his or her family with a psychologist trained in repatriation issues. Next, the AT&T makes sure that the employees always feel that he or she is still in the loop with the home office. And lastly, AT&T provides formal repatriation services, which includes psychologists and an HR representative that meets with the expat and the family to start preparing them. They also help plan the employee's next career move and help the person update his or her resume and begin putting the person in contact with supervisors back home. They also work with the person's family on the logistics of the move back. Then, about a month after returning home, the expat and family attend a welcome home seminar to discuss matters like the stress of repatriation. Now, let us discuss how to put into practice a global HR system by managing the human resources locally. Now, the current trend is becoming a global company. Global companies seek to be fully integrated. For example, a car to be sold in the United States might be designed in France and manufactured in China with parts coming from Japan. This global approach has at least two big implications for human resource management. First, it generally means that the company as a whole will want to be able to redeploy their best employees anywhere the firm does business. For example, Hilton Worldwide's databanks contain information on every employee's skill, affiliations, language proficiency, and local market connections. Hilton can therefore easily transfer willing employees wherever necessary. Next is by being global, it also affects how the company organizes and manages its human resource management function with the emphasis often on standardizing HR practices worldwide. In a study where the researchers interviewed the human resource personnel from 6 global companies such as Agilent, Dow, IBM, Motorola, Procter& Gamble, and Shell Oil Company, as well as international human resources consultants, the overall conclusion was that employers who successfully implemented a global HR system do so by applying several best practices. The basic idea is to develop systems that are acceptable to employees in units around the world and ones that the employers can implement more effectively. Here in the left portion of our slide is the illustration of the best practices for creating the global HR system. First is to develop the international HR system, such as by forming global networks. And then next is to take steps to ensure that the system is acceptable to those who must implement it, such as by investigating pressures to differentiate practices. And last is to implement the international HR system and practices, such as by allocating adequate resources. And then it all goes back to development or improving the international HR system. Let us proceed with the first best practice that we have mentioned, which is developing a more effective global HR system. The employers engage in two best practices in developing their worldwide human resource policies and practices. First is to form global HR networks. To head off resistance, the human resource managers around the world should feel part of the firm's global human resource management team. It is also important to treat the local human resource managers as equal partners. And for instance, from global teams to develop the new human resources system, and also to create an infrastructure of partners around the world that you use for support, for buy-in, for organization of local activities, and to help you better understand their own systems and their own challenges. Next is to remember that it's more important to standardize ends and competencies than specific methods. For example, in IBM, they use a basically standardized recruitment and selection process worldwide. However, details such as who conducts the interview, whether the hiring manager or the recruiter, or whether the pre-screen is by phone or in person, usually differ by country. Now, let us proceed by making the global HR system more acceptable. Employers engage in three best practices so that the global human resource systems they develop will be acceptable to local managers around the world. These practices are: first, to remember that truly global organizations find it easier to install global systems. For example, their managers work on global teams and the firms identify, recruit, and place employees globally. Doing so makes it easier for managers everywhere to accept the wisdom of having a standardized human resource management system. Next is to investigate pressures to differentiate and determine their legitimacy. Local managers will sometimes insist you can't do that here because we are different culturally. These differences aren't usually persuasive, so it is important to be knowledgeable about local legal issues and be willing to differentiate where necessary. And lastly is to try to work within the context of a strong corporate culture. Companies that do so find it easier to obtain agreement among far-flung employees. Having such global unanimity makes it easier to implement standardized human resource practices. Lastly is implementing the global HR system. Finally, two best practices help ensure success in actually implementing the globally consistent human resource policies and practices. They say you can't communicate enough. There's a need for constant contact with the decision makers in each country, as well as the people who will be implementing and using the system. And also to dedicate adequate resources. For example, don't require the local human resource management offices to implement new job analysis procedures unless the head office provides adequate resources for these additional activities. So there we have it. Let us just have a quick recap on what we have discussed in our previous slides. First, dealing with global human resource challenges includes an array of political, social, legal, and cultural differences among countries abroad. What works in one country may not work in another. The need for adapting human resource activities to inter-country differences influences employers' HR processes. Staffing, the global organization is also a major challenge. Companies may use expatriates, home country nationals, locals, or third country nationals. Selecting employees to successfully work abroad depends on several things. Most important.
Okay, so the human resource management, no, uh, so human resource management at a public or private organization that operates in more than one country or continent is known as a global human resource management. No? So it entails supporting, managing, and engaging personnel all throughout the world, no? While implementing common policies while also considering local laws, customs, and cultures. No? So while a company may use a single name and provide identical products and services all over the world, workers in different operating nations may have very different requirements. The typical working hours and salary benchmark may differ, of course, no? Workplace facilities, communication, procedures, and management frameworks may be affected by cultural variation. So furthermore, each country's regulations may necessitate a unique approach to taxation, employment contracts, statutory benefits, and performance management. So under a single employer brand, this can be a complicated set of variables to manage. So the most Up-to-date global human resource cloud software platforms and solutions can assist organizations with policy planning and management, as well as ensuring compliance with local laws. Not tailored, no, when it comes to a human resource cloud software platforms, no, it tailored workforce experience, no, customized communication. It deliver business updates, targets communication to specific groups, and gather feedback with surveys. For personal experiences, creating engaging, branded experiences tailored by group or region. So connect global teams, manage your entire workforce, whether they are, no, embed global policies while enforcing local regulations, help teams thrive anywhere, support employee well-being, provide localized benefits packages, and more. And there is a powerful and actionable human resource analytics now. So it gain instant visibility. So gain complete visibility to your entire workforce through human resource analytics, enabling actionable insights in seconds. Now, it provide real-time insights. Now, give leaders up to the minute analytic and recommendations so they can analyze emerging trends quickly and adjust plans as needed. It customized dashboards. No? Personalized dashboard to plan hiring, analysis attrition, manage absences, and more. And they can gather actionable feedback. No, it get clarity on the employee life cycle with surveys and pulse tailor to different groups of functions. So actually, it is also attract and retain talent. No, automate new requisitions, candidate screening, reference checks, and interview scheduling. It accelerates hiring decisions and reduce attrition by creating employer-branded experience and make onboarding a breeze with self-service access to automated forms and tailored communication. The automated HR can cut unnecessary admin and paperwork by automating core human resource process easily. No, it accelerates digital and business transformation by connecting your teams digitally and boosts HR productivity, reduce errors, and spend more time adding value. So this will be the drive new ways of working. No, it design new ways of working with a new code, highly configurable system built on Salesforce, and it configure workflows, adapt policies, and measure impact to enable agility and business success. It unlocks continuous innovation through real-time employee feedback. So I think that's it for global human resource management.